TSN's Darren Dreger is an NHL insider and, of course, one half of the Ray and Dregs hockey podcast. He joins us Mondays. Good to see you. Good to hear you.
Yeah.
Busy weekend. I'm sure it was. I want to almost do a blow-by-blow here on Friday night with you, Dregs. So it's like 8:30. Where are you when the JT Miller news breaks? Yeah, it's like 8 o'clock or whatever.
Or when you get the first crumb,
Eastern
because he showed
time,
up. He showed up.
We all become aware that he gets scratched from the game against Dallas. Take us from there.
Yeah, I mean, I was at home, thankfully. That isn't necessarily the norm on a Friday night. You're out. You've had a busy week. Sometimes you're with friends. This time of year, though, I'm always a little bit cautious, right? It just had the feel of it. And, not to go back to the Carolina-Colorado trade, but that also happened, obviously, 2 Fridays ago now, right? So that happens, and you're like, okay, that's a pretty stiff reminder that we need to be on full alert here moving forward. So, the Vancouver saga, everything around JT Miller, everything around Pettersson, been so well documented, and we talked about it and talked about it and talked about it. And every day I'd check in, and the messaging that I'd get back was always kind of the same thing. Yeah, still lots of conversation. Don't know if it's going to happen the next hour or if it's ever going to happen, right? And then things started to percolate on Friday, to your point, and the reporting on this one across the board was solid. So as soon as we learned that Miller had been asked to waive his no trade, no move, verbally said yes, and then was quickly trying to get out of Dallas to rejoin his new club. Well, now you talk about, okay, well, what are the other elements that are involved in this trade? And all sides were pretty careful in this one. So again, what we learned was that don't get caught up on the main piece being JT Miller. Like, this is a much bigger deal than what you might think. So, when that information came in, then we started to put the pieces of the puzzle together. But I'll tell you this, fellas, and this isn't a knock on Chris Drury, because, automatically there are some of us, the opinionists in our world, who want to go hard after, okay, here's the winner, here's the loser. And instantly the reaction was, when the deal was made official, well, Vancouver didn't get enough in the return for JT Miller. But I can tell you that this is the deal, essentially the deal that the Canucks, Patrick Allvin, had been pushing Chris Drury on for well over a month. And it really came down to Victor Mancini. That's really what it came down to in the end. They knew they were getting that first-round draft pick. That's probably why they were so quick to flip over to the Pittsburgh Penguins and get that deal with Drew O'Connor and Marcus Pettersson done. But it took till whatever that hour was on Friday, call it the 11th hour, doesn't matter. Maybe the 11th hour for Drury and the New York Rangers, where he went, all right, I'll throw in that piece. And that piece is Victor Mancini. And I think Canucks fans are going to grow into appreciating how good this kid is, because he's trending on being a second pair for sure in the National Hockey League.
Really? Wow. Yeah. More on that, Dregs. Who are you talking to there? What's the outlook for Mancini?
Well, that's it. And I honestly didn't know a whole lot about him, but as soon as this deal went down, Frankie Corrado, who I know you guys respect and have a lot of time for, instantly sent me a text message, and he goes, boy, said, I'm telling you, this Mancini kid is the real deal. And he made some comparisons in terms of who he thinks he's better than, who are pretty good players with the New York Rangers currently. I won't throw the names out there, but if Mancini comes anywhere close to the names that Corrado mentioned, then this guy's going to be legit. He's going to be the real deal. And I know, again, in following up, Vancouver thought, given the circumstances, that they did okay. They get a centerman back. They're going to probably try and add another centerman. That makes a lot of sense here. But they get a good young D back, and they managed to clean up the organization a little bit as well. So they like their collection of good young D. And overall, they like how the things kind of shook down when both trades were ultimately resolved and put to bed.
Yeah, we got the same text from Frank Corrado. He'll join us Wednesday as the president of the Victor Mancini fan club.
Retweeted a goal scored by Hedl on a fabulous feed by by Mancini when Ray's calling the game, and Ray is glowing about Mancini's play throughout the course of that game. Ray saying in that clip, "I haven't seen him live before, but boy, is he good." So there's some good things ahead. They get the first round pick, as you mentioned. Immediately turn their attention to Kyle Dubas, and how long had those discussions been really on the front burner for the Vancouver Canucks?
I would think for a while, right? And isn't that interesting how things do link together? And it's not always, one team making that big splashy trade like Colorado and Carolina that gets the dominoes falling. In this case, it's internal. It's an internal game of dominoes. Like, obviously, the Canucks needed that first-round draft pick to execute the deal with Dubas and the Pittsburgh Penguins. And now you've got some, again, internal information and knowledge, Jim Rutherford, Patrick Allvin, in both those guys, in O'Connor and in Marcus Pettersson. And I don't know how hard Dubas was shopping Drew O'Connor, but his name has popped up with a number of teams. I heard Vegas had explored some interest, and then when Vegas, was basically gifted Brandon Saad, after the mutually terminated deal, it felt like that was maybe Vegas going in a different direction. Who knows? I mean, McCrimmon might add another forward there, but I think that's kind of what was gumming things up here. There would have been lots of conversations between Dubas and Allvin specific to those guys, maybe one of those guys, but the fact that they got both is impressive work.
And he looked good in his opener. The criticism had been that he doesn't finish this year. He had a decent finishing year last year, similar numbers to Danton Heinen, who goes the other way.
Yeah.
But at least he's noticeable. Like, if you're not going to finish, at least show the buzzsaw. And Heinen was just a little bit too invisible on a lot of nights. And again, it's only one game for Drew O'Connor, but it's just nice to see a guy with that speed who's noticeable.
Well, and look, I'm telling you again, I mentioned Vegas, and I don't want to oversell that, but when you think of the Vegas Golden Knights and the style of hockey that they play, it is a heavier type of game, right? It's based on skill. I mean, you've got to have that complement of both. But if you've got really strong defensive-minded players, forwards, that play that structured style that Cassidy demands, like O'Connor's name had kind of been percolating around the Toronto Maple Leafs as well. And the reason I even throw that out there is, again, specific to a coach who likes that heavier brand of hockey. So I don't know that you're going to be able to lean on O'Connor as being a consistent secondary scorer, but most coaches are okay with that, provided the other elements of the detail of your game are there. And I think that Vancouver gets that in Drew O'Connor. And what is he, 26 years old? I mean, this kid is just nicely coming into his prime. And we know, because the organization has acknowledged, like, their preference, their intent is to extend those two guys who are pending unrestricted free agents. So we'll see.
Yeah, Mike Sullivan with some nice words about Drew O'Connor on his way out the door. Yes, 26 years old. So, Darren, what's your understanding of where the Canucks are now? They're looking to add you mentioned a centerman. They're looking to add a centerman to the existing group by the trade deadline and make a major push for this year's Stanley Cup playoffs, or are they still listening on Elias Pettersson?
I think they have to be listening. I kind of paused there because I don't want to undersell it, but I also don't want to oversell it. And I think that the preference right now is to just give Pettersson and the group some time to heal and to breathe and to settle. And first of all, it starts with Elias Pettersson, right? Like, he's got to find a more consistent game. That's his job. That's his priority, because now all the excuses have been washed away. So there will be a higher level of expectation. But that expectation, if he isn't traded between now and, let's say, the off season, if you want to include the off season, is to focus on what can make his game better and what can make his game stronger. It's really difficult to get physically stronger in season because the schedule just doesn't allow it. But that will be priority one for Pettersson. And the reason I'm not just flat out saying no, they're not interested in trading him at this point is because how many conversations did Patrick Allvin and Jimmy Rutherford have with so many different suitors that were interested in Pettersson? Those conversations don't go away. How many times are we reminded when big deals happen? I think of Jack Eichel going from Buffalo to the Vegas Golden Knights, and Adams and McCrimmon acknowledging that deal had been in the works for months and months and months. So as we're having this conversation today, yeah, it doesn't seem likely, does it, that Pettersson will be traded? But based on the conversation that Alvin has had with so many different hockey execs, hey, we're still a month away from the trade deadline. Anything is possible.
Are there any hurt feelings in the room about how it all played out, do you think? Is the Miller faction in the room? Do you think they're upset at what's happened so far, or is everybody able to push the reset button at this point, do you think?
Well, I mean, that's the hope and that's the expectation. I mean, you're professionals, so find a way to, Ray always reminds me of this on the podcast. When you see teams go through dark patches, valleys, in what should be a better year, what normally needs to happen is each individual player has to take stock of his individual play. And as individuals, if you can play the role that Rick Tocchet is asking of you, and you do that on a consistent basis, then the sum of the parts should take over, and they should be a playoff team. So, when you asked a minute or two ago about, okay, well, what is the thinking now? Well, the thinking now is to continue to assess what this group is and where they are at. Of course, making the playoffs is expected in Vancouver, from top of the organization all the way to the bottom. But what's equally of value here is looking ahead to the start of next season and what that roster looks like, which again brings us back to maybe ongoing Elias Pettersson speculation. Because look, right now, Pettersson is not giving the Vancouver Canucks what they need. He's not up the middle of the ice, not offensively. So that then again spins the need for bringing in a more dependable or impactful center until Pettersson can take on more of that role. And let's not underestimate how much cap space does Vancouver now have.
They've got a fair bit now.
There you go, man.
That was one of the offshoots of all the dealing. Well, let me ask you about that, because Brock Nelson's a rental. There's some more third-line profile rental guys that are out there, Gourde, Frederick, Evans, and some others. Middlestad, Cousins, and O'Reilly.
Yeah.
They're guys with term remaining, all of whom, I mean, second-line center might be a bridge too far for some of these guys, the way they're playing. Others have absolutely been that and more.
Yeah,
in their careers. Do you hear the Canucks connected to any of those guys? Do any three of those guys make sense for Vancouver, given the different composition of the team they have?
Yeah, well, I could make a case for all of those guys, but, really then what you have to boil it down to is which one of the names that you just threw out there is capable of being a second-line center. Right. And that's where it gets a little bit challenging. What is the status of Ryan O'Reilly with the Nashville Predators? I'm sure we'll be talking about that at some point this week on Insider Trading, because things have seemingly gone quiet in Nashville. Does he still have the game required to fit in that 2 spot? And I think he does. Am I positive? No, I'm not positive. Philadelphia thinks they're getting a first-round draft pick for Scotty Lawton. On a lot of good teams, Scott Lawton would be a third-line center. That's really what he is. We're seeing the Philadelphia Flyers sell off some pieces now because they too are trying to acquire cap space. Philadelphia is recognizing a bit of unrest in that market. They want to give their fans something to focus on. So sure, they're selling hope, but they want to get into that game of big game hunting. And that'll come through free agency. So they're trying to move off some pieces. I think Ryan Strome with the Ducks, not a lot of activity from a media perspective around him, but that market is a tough one. Dylan Cousins, you mentioned. I had a conversation with somebody with the Buffalo Sabres this morning, guys. Okay, and if you're going after Dylan Cousins, what are you giving up? Pettersson? I'm asking honestly because Kevin Adams doesn't want futures attached to a trade that's going to send out Dylan Cousins. He's not. And he's getting 20 calls. 20 teams are interested in Dylan Cousins. And he's not even shopping him. But the message is, and Calgary's on that list, of course. It seems like Calgary's fixated on Dylan Cousins. Okay, well, who's going back the other way? Connor Zary? Like, I mean, if I'm Kevin Adams, I'm looking at one of the top young players for the Vancouver Canucks or the Calgary Flames or any of the other teams who have called in Dylan Cousins and saying, okay, well, that's what I need coming back to even engage in this conversation.
What's left in Trevor Zegras? Like, what is Trevor Zegras?
Well, he's an enigma for starters. You feel like you know what you should get offensively. Everybody around him talks like he wants and is still putting in the work to kind of polish up some of the other aspects of his game. I'm not sure that we see that on a continued basis. He's had some injury issues that he's had to contend with. I've poked around on Trevor Zegras probably 2-3 times in the last 2-3 weeks. And the message is that it's relatively quiet on him there. But that's not to say that can't change, with that phone call, but more likely things heat up in the off season. But he's an interesting piece because, you're just not sure the way it's going to play out. I mean, nobody comes with any level of guarantee, but it also is getting to that place where it feels like he might need a change of scenery. So may not be a terrible bet.
Lastly, Darren, we heard Friday that the cap is going up $7.5 million for next year and some pretty sizable jumps thereafter if the CBA can be negotiated and everything stays the same. Now, Blake and I had a pretty good debate about that. Don't make any kind of assumptions with an NHL PA CBA, not to mention all the trade and tariff business that is going on. So who knows where the economics will go beyond next year. But in the near term, do you see this facilitating trades? Are we going to have a busier deadline season because GMs know they've got some wiggle? They got some wiggle coming.
Well, they do, but it depends on which ownership group you're talking to. If you're talking to one of the 7 Canadian guys, they're looking at the Canadian dollar, and now they're looking at the cap projections, and they're looking at their free agents, RFAs and UFAs, and all they're saying is it's going to be an expensive summer. That's what they're saying. And then furthermore, specific to the CBA agreement, I don't think this is getting enough interest. So there's a couple of areas one is a necessity. And the other one might be a little bit too pie in the sky. So the pie in the sky one is some sort of leveling of the discrepancy in taxation across the NHL, the 32 separate markets. Okay, well, you find clubs that are in high tax markets, and those are the ones that are looking for equalization. And then you ask the owners of the teams in the low tax brackets, and they're like, buzz off. How do we manage that kind of stuff? So here's a phrase that we're going to learn and we're going to hear a lot of in the weeks and months ahead, and it's called competitive balance. And I don't really think it applies to Vancouver beyond the obvious and the Canadian dollar and the political uncertainty and all of that. I think it's more targeting Winnipeg, maybe Ottawa. I mean, there's only so many dollars you can glean and pull out of your local market before that imbalance starts to creep in. I mean, can Winnipeg afford a $100+ million payroll? No. So what is that revenue sharing model going to look like? And we've been assured in reporting that whatever the adjustments that are made that are needed to that revenue sharing model are coming from the owner's side, not out of bargaining with the players and the CBA. And there's going to be pushback from some of the fat cat owners. Why wouldn't there be? I mean, hey, I don't think any of the big clubs are going to want to, prop up the Winnipeg Jets or any small market team in the NHL. But that, unfortunately, is going to be the reality, to push that salary cap well above $110 million.
When I saw you tweet that, Dregs, on revenue sharing, a shiver went up my spine because I know the potential there.
But give Winnipeg credit, guys. Winnipeg's spending $86 million as we speak right now. Yeah. You've got Ottawa at $84 million. Like they're within an arm's reach of the cap limit. Now, again, 3 years from now, when it's going to bump, we'll see where they're at. But really, when I'm looking at the price tags right now, there's 5 teams that to me aren't within an arm's reach. And that's San Jose, Minnesota, Calgary, Anaheim, and Columbus. Yeah. Those are the teams that just aren't spending right now. And that's a lot for building purposes too, right?
So a couple of things to remember on Winnipeg. Number one, a lot of those commitments would have been made with a stronger Canadian dollar.
Yeah.
Number two, well, I know Mark Chipman is the managing partner there. His partner, David Thompson, is worth $71 billion. Like he's the richest owner in the National Hockey League, far and away, could buy them everybody over several
Rich
times.
guys don't like to lose money.
No, I
they
understand
don't.
that. I understand that. But, let's remember, it's not just a Chipman equation there. They are backed by the biggest wallet on the block. And then lastly, Dregs, I wanted to ask you this. After we saw that absolute stunt, you talk about a day for an insider. How about Shams Charania on Saturday? Luka Doncic for Anthony Davis. This is real. I'm actually going to tweet this out. People are going to think I'm hacked, and sure enough, they did. Superstar for superstar in the NBA. There was another big NBA trade there yesterday involving all-star, if not superstar players. There are 2 no-trade clauses in the NBA. LeBron James and somehow Bradley Beal. There are 270 plus players in the National Hockey League with some kind of trade protection. How did we get here? And is this going to be a CBA matter? Have you heard any scuttlebutt about putting a clamp down on the number of no trade clauses that are out there?
I haven't, and I'd be curious as you're talking, and I knew which direction that question was headed. What would be the concession if you're the players to give back on that? Right? What do you need from the National Hockey League to claw back on that? And that's really what the essence of the Players Association is to, manage the best interests of the player. Well, any player, especially those players with a young family like JT Miller has, as we know, you fight hard for that no-move clause. And the no-move clause is, I don't know how many of those exist, like a blanket no-move clause, probably more than we think.
Yeah, a lot fewer, though.
Yeah. No trade clauses. I mean, they can be manipulated. The general managers they barely roll their eyes at that kind of stuff now, because you can pressure a player into going to where the best deal is simply by saying, okay, well, if you don't accept this deal, then I'm going to trade you over here. And it's probably not a whole lot better, although it's a team that isn't on your no-fly zone. I mean, there's always sorts of leverage points, but I don't think it'll be a big CBA item. I really don't.
The Rangers have 5 no moves.
No, I know.
On their own.
It's just incredible. Moves. You go to Puckpedia or one of the sites, and just the number of notations, NMC, NTC.
Dregs, before you go, Shams had to clarify this is real. Have you ever had to clarify when you tweeted out a trade, I'm serious, this is real? Do you remember anything close to that?
Not really, and this was pre-social media, but I kind of stumbled onto the Joe Thornton trade. I broke the Joe Thornton trade from Boston to San Jose. I'll divulge my source now, and it was the late, great John Ferguson Sr., who, by the way, I still have his number in my cell phone. He was such a good man.
Yeah. But Vancouverite John Ferguson Sr.
I posted that on .ca at Sportsnet at the time. I wasn't even at TSN, and I laid in my basement in the fetal position.
Right.
Because back
Please
then,
be right. Please be right.
Yeah, you're waiting for confirmation from either San Jose or from the Boston Bruins, and
oh man,
that was a tough one. So I didn't. Yeah, I mean, but that certainly would have been one if there had been Twitter, X, whatever social media that I would have had to have applied the qualifier to.
Yeah, and of course we had that day in 2016 with Subban for Weber and Larson for Taylor Hall. That shook us to our core. And on the no trade clauses, yes, NBA GMs have held the line more on them, but also 4 or 5 years of flat cap, whatever it was, Dregs. Because money wasn't in the system, players started taking trade protection.
Right, agreed. They don't get $20 million like the NBA players. So
no,
we got
that's
to get
right.
something.
Yeah. Awesome stuff. Thank you, sir. Until next Monday.
All right, guys. Have a great week.